The scent of old wood and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun filled Ilara's new apartment. It was a smell that spoke of history, of countless lives lived within these walls, and for Ilara, a young archivist seeking a fresh start, it was a comforting aroma. She'd found the place online, a surprisingly affordable gem in a historic district, nestled amongst buildings that whispered tales of a bygone era. The listing had called it charming, and despite the slightly crooked door frames and the persistent, almost imperceptible tilt to the living room floor, Ilara agreed. It had character, a soul that modern, sterile apartments lacked. Her old life, a tangle of bad decisions and lingering regrets, felt miles away both geographically and emotionally. This apartment, with its high ceilings and tall, narrow windows, was to be her sanctuary, a blank slate upon which she could finally write a new, more peaceful narrative. She unpacked her boxes methodically, her movements precise and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined her recent past. Books, her most cherished possessions, found their places on makeshift shelves of stacked milk crates. Her small collection of antique maps, each a testament to forgotten journeys, were carefully unrolled and tacked to the plaster walls, their faded lines a silent promise of new discoveries. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The city outside, usually a symphony of distant sirens and rumbling traffic, seemed to hold its breath. Ilara lay in her new bed, a thin mattress on the floor, and listened to the settling groans of the old building. It was a symphony of creaks and whispers, a constant reminder that she was not alone, not truly. The wind, a playful phantom, snaked through unseen cracks, creating drafts that raised goosebumps on her arms. She pulled the thin blanket tighter, a small smile playing on her lips. These were the quirks she had embraced, the charming imperfections that made this place unique. She spent the next few days in a haze of unpacking and organizing, her archivist's mind finding solace in the systematic arrangement of her belongings. Each book, each document, each piece of furniture had its designated spot, a small victory against the disorder that had once threatened to consume her. The apartment, slowly but surely, began to feel like home. She discovered a small hidden alcove in the kitchen, perfect for her collection of vintage teacups. The bathroom, with its clawfoot tub, became her private oasis, a place where she could soak away the day's anxieties. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound tranquility, a subtle unease began to stir. It was nothing she could pinpoint, no overt sign of trouble, just a faint whisper of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the building. The drafts, once charming, now felt like cold fingers tracing her skin. The creaks and groans of the old wood, once comforting, now sounded like hushed conversations just beyond the reach of her understanding. She dismissed it as fatigue, a lingering echo of her past anxieties. A new city, a new life, it was bound to come with its own set of adjustments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ilara found herself staring at the wall in her living room. It was a long, unbroken stretch of plaster, interrupted only by a single ornate fireplace. She had plans for that wall, a large tapestry she'd inherited from her grandmother, a vibrant splash of color to break the monotony. But as she looked at it, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. The wall seemed too long. It was an absurd thought, of course. Walls didn't just stretch. But the feeling persisted, a nagging itch in her mind that refused to be scratched. She shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips. She was tired, that was all. The move had taken more out of her than she'd realized. She needed a good night's sleep, and then, perhaps, a strong cup of coffee. The apartment was fine. She was fine. Everything was going to be just fine. The silence that followed her thoughts seemed to deepen, the old building holding its breath, waiting. The tapestry, a riot of crimson and gold, lay folded on the floor, waiting for its moment of glory. Ilara, armed with a tape measure and a pencil, began to plot its placement on the long wall. She stretched the metal tape from one corner to the other, noting the measurement. Then she moved to the opposite wall, intending to measure the room's width. It was a simple task, one she performed countless times in previous apartments, a mundane act of domesticity. But as the numbers on the tape measure unfurled, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of unease ran through her. The living room, according to her quick mental calculation, was roughly 15 feet wide. Yet when she measured the exterior of the building from the street using the architectural blueprints she'd been given by the landlord, the dimensions didn't quite align. The building's exterior suggested a slightly smaller interior space, a discrepancy of about 3 feet. It was a minor detail easily dismissed as a rounding error or a quirk of old construction. But Ilara, with her archivist's eye for detail and her innate need for order, couldn't let it go. 3 feet was not a rounding error. 3 feet was a small closet, a narrow pantry, a forgotten nook. It was a space. She consulted the blueprints again, spreading the brittle, yellowed paper across her kitchen table. Her finger traced the lines following the layout of her apartment. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. And then, tucked away between the living room and the bedroom, a small, unlabeled rectangle. It was marked as storage, a tiny, almost insignificant space, barely large enough for a broom closet. But there was no broom closet in her apartment. The wall where it should have been was seamless, a smooth expanse of plaster, unbroken by any door or indentation. She ran her hand over the spot, feeling nothing but the cool, unyielding surface. The discrepancy gnawed at her. She measured again, this time with meticulous care, double-checking her figures, her brow furrowed in concentration. The interior measurement of the living room remained consistent. The exterior measurement of the building, according to the blueprint, also remained consistent. The 3-foot gap persisted, a phantom limb of a room that simply wasn't there. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the architectural matrix, and it bothered her more than it should have. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the blueprints were outdated. Perhaps the building had undergone renovations that weren't documented. Perhaps the landlord had simply made a mistake. But none of these explanations felt right. The building was old, yes, but its structure seemed remarkably intact. The walls were solid, the plaster uncracked. There were no signs of recent construction or alteration. The space was simply unaccounted for, a void in the apartment's layout. Ilara walked the perimeter of her living room, her gaze fixed on the seamless wall where the storage space should have been. She tapped it lightly with her knuckles, listening for any change in the sound. It was solid, unyielding, a dull thud that offered no hint of hollowness. Yet the blueprint insisted. A small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered, "Where does the extra footage go?" The question lingered, a persistent hum in the quiet apartment. It was a question that defied logic, a puzzle with a missing piece. Ilara, a woman who thrived on solving puzzles, felt an unfamiliar prickle of excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about a missing closet anymore. This was about something more, something hidden, something that the building itself seemed determined to keep secret. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a riddle, its walls holding a secret that was slowly, inexorably, revealing itself. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken possibilities. Ilara stood in the deepening twilight, her hand still resting on the smooth, unyielding wall, a silent challenge passing between her and the old building. The game, she realized, had just begun. The anomaly of the missing 3 feet became an obsession. Ilara couldn't shake it. It was a persistent itch in her mind, a loose thread in the otherwise neat tapestry of her new life. She found herself drawn to that seamless stretch of wall in the living room, her fingers tracing its smooth surface as if searching for a hidden seam. The blueprints, now her constant companions, lay open on the coffee table, the tiny, unlabeled rectangle mocking her with its silent presence. Storage, it claimed. But where? She started systematically, tapping along the wall with the heel of her hand, listening intently to the subtle variations in sound. Most of it was solid, a dull, reassuring thud that spoke of plaster and lath. But then, about halfway down the wall, near the floor, there was a faint difference. A slight, almost imperceptible hollowness. It was so subtle, she almost missed it, dismissing it as a trick of the light or an echo in the quiet apartment. But her archivist training, her meticulous attention to detail, urged her to investigate further. She knelt, pressing her ear against the cool plaster. The hollowness was still there, a faint, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. It was like listening to a seashell, the distant roar of an ocean contained within. She ran her hand over the spot again, more slowly this time, her fingertips searching for any irregularity. Nothing. The paint was smooth, the wallpaper perfectly aligned. It was as if the wall itself was a master of disguise, concealing its secrets with an almost malicious intent. Undeterred, Ilara retrieved the small, flat-head screwdriver from her toolbox. With gentle, deliberate movements, she began to scrape away a tiny section of the wallpaper, just enough to expose the plaster beneath. Her heart hammered a little faster, a mix of anticipation and a strange, nascent fear. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a patch of thin plaster, a structural quirk of the old building? But the faint hollowness persisted, a silent invitation. As the wallpaper peeled back, revealing layers of faded floral patterns and ancient newsprint, a faint line began to emerge. It was almost invisible, a hairline crack in the plaster, but it was there, and it wasn't a crack. It was a seam, a perfectly straight, almost imperceptible line that ran vertically from the floor to the ceiling. It was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be a flaw in the construction. This was intentional. This was hidden. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. This wasn't just a missing storage space. This was a secret. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal this. The thrill of discovery, the intellectual challenge of uncovering a hidden truth, momentarily eclipsed any burgeoning fear. Her mind, accustomed to deciphering ancient text and forgotten histories, was now fully engaged in unraveling this architectural mystery. She continued to carefully scrape away the layers, following the faint seam. The line widened, revealing a tiny gap, a sliver of darkness that hinted at something beyond. She pressed her ear to the gap, listening. Nothing. Just the faint, stale smell of old air, trapped and undisturbed for decades. With renewed determination, Alara worked her way around the perimeter of what she now knew was a hidden door. The seam was expertly disguised, the wallpaper and paint applied with a meticulousness that spoke of deliberate concealment. It was a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era, a secret passage designed to blend seamlessly into its surroundings. Finally, she reached the bottom of the door. There, almost completely obscured by layers of paint, she found a small, almost flush handle. It was a simple brass knob, tarnished with age, but still functional. She gripped it, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it, the moment of truth. She twisted the handle. It turned with a soft click, a sound that echoed loudly in the silent apartment. She pulled. The door, stiff from years of disuse, groaned in protest, a low, mournful sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the building. With a final, determined tug, it swung inward, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. A cloud of ancient dust billowed out, carrying with it the scent of decay and stagnation. Alara coughed, waving a hand in front of her face. The darkness within was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light from the living room. She peered into the abyss, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The thrill of discovery was still there, but now it was tinged with a new, unsettling emotion. A prickle of unease, a whisper of dread. What was so important to hide behind this cleverly concealed door, and why had it been hidden for so long? The questions hung in the stale air, unanswered, beckoning her forward. The darkness beyond the newly opened door was absolute. A void that seemed to absorb the light from the living room, leaving only a deeper, more profound blackness. Alara stood on the threshold, a flashlight clutched in her hand, its beam cutting a hesitant path into the unknown. The air that wafted out was thick with the scent of decay and stagnation, a smell that spoke of long-forgotten things and undisturbed time. It was a smell that made the back of her throat tighten, a primal warning that something was not right. She took a deep breath, the dust motes dancing in the flashlight's beam like tiny, malevolent spirits. Her archivist's curiosity, a force that had always driven her, warred with a growing sense of apprehension. This wasn't just an old closet, this was something else entirely. The meticulous concealment of the door, the sheer effort involved in making it disappear, hinted at a secret far more significant than a mere storage space. Stepping over the threshold, Alara felt the floor beneath her feet. It was solid, but the air inside was unnaturally still, heavy, as if time itself had paused within these confines. The beam of her flashlight swept across the small room. It was indeed small, no more than 8 feet by 10, and utterly devoid of furniture or any discernible purpose. The walls were bare, the plaster a uniform, faded beige, indistinguishable from the rest of the apartment's interior. There were no windows, no vents, no signs of any connection to the outside world. It was a sealed box, a forgotten tomb. The dust was thick, a fine, powdery layer that coated every surface. It lay undisturbed, a testament to the decades, perhaps even centuries, that this room had remained hidden. Alara's boots left clear imprints in the pristine layer. She took a few tentative steps further inside. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket that muffled even the sound of her own breathing. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, that made your ears ring, that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence in itself. Her flashlight beam finally settled on the far wall, and there, faint but undeniable, were patterns. Geometric shapes, etched or painted onto the plaster, almost completely obscured by the layers of dust and grime. They weren't decorative, not like the floral wallpaper she'd peeled away from the door. These were stark, angular, and seemed to defy conventional geometry. Lines intersected at impossible angles, shapes twisted into forms that her mind struggled to comprehend. They were like a diagram, a complex alien blueprint, but for what? Alara moved closer, her heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She reached out a gloved hand, hesitant to disturb the ancient dust. The patterns were subtle, almost ethereal, as if they were slowly emerging from the wall itself, or perhaps fading into it. She traced a finger along one of the lines, feeling the faint indentation beneath the dust. It was cold, colder than the rest of the room, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The air, already stale, seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in the air, a low frequency that she felt more than heard. It was like the distant thrum of a massive engine or the deep resonance of a forgotten bell. It was unsettling, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She pulled her hand back, a shiver running down her spine. The room was empty, yes, but it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, not by a person, but by something else, something unseen, something that had left its mark on these walls. The geometric patterns seemed to pulse faintly in the flashlight's beam, almost as if they were alive, breathing. Ilara's archivist mind, usually so adept at categorizing and understanding, found itself struggling to process what she was seeing. These weren't historical artifacts in the traditional sense. They were something else, something that defied explanation, something that hinted at a reality beyond her comprehension. Why was this room so empty? What was its purpose? And what did these strange, unsettling patterns mean? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The thrill of discovery had given way to a profound sense of dread. She was no longer just an archivist uncovering a hidden past. She was an intruder, standing on the threshold of something ancient and unknowable. The silence of the room seemed to deepen, the faint hum growing almost imperceptibly louder, a silent invitation to delve deeper into its secrets. The faint hum in the secret room intensified, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and settle directly in her bones. It was a disorienting sensation, like standing on a ship's deck in a calm sea, where the subtle sway of the vessel is just enough to throw off your equilibrium. Ilara felt a strange pressure behind her eyes, a subtle distortion in her vision that made the already unsettling geometric patterns on the far wall seem to shift and writhe. The angles of the room, which had initially appeared stark and simple, now seemed subtly off, as if the corners weren't quite 90 degrees or the ceiling wasn't perfectly parallel to the floor. It was a wrongness she couldn't quite articulate, a feeling that defied the logical rules of space and dimension. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the door frame, a solid anchor in a space that felt increasingly fluid. The air, already stale, now carried a faint metallic tang, like ozone after a lightning strike, or the scent of old blood. It was a smell that made her stomach clench, a visceral reaction to something deeply unnatural. The dust motes, still dancing in her flashlight beam, seemed to swirl with a purpose, forming fleeting, almost recognizable shapes before dissolving back into chaos. Ilara's mind, usually so sharp and analytical, felt sluggish, as if wading through thick mud. She tried to focus on the patterns, to decipher their meaning, but her gaze kept slatting off them, her brain refusing to process the impossible geometry. It was like trying to read a language written in shadows, where the letters themselves refused to hold still. A cold dread began to seep into her, a fear that was less about what she might find and more about what this place was doing to her perception, to her very sanity. She forced herself to take another step, then another, until she was back on the threshold, the familiar wood of her living room floor beneath her feet. The hum of the secret room seemed to recede, but the disorienting sensation lingered, a faint echo in her mind. She turned, her eyes scanning her living room, the space that had felt so comforting just moments before. And then she saw it. The wall, the very wall that had concealed the secret room, now seemed to possess the same unsettling wrongness she had felt inside. The corner where it met the ceiling appeared to be slightly acute, not the perfect right angle it should have been. The line where the wall met the floor seemed to curve inward, almost imperceptibly, creating a subtle distortion that made the entire room feel off-kilter. It was as if the secret room had infected her apartment, bleeding its impossible geometry into her reality. Ilara blinked, rubbing her eyes. Was it just her imagination? The lingering effects of the stale air and the strange hum. She walked over to the corner, running her hand along the plaster. It felt solid, unyielding, just as it always had, but her eyes told a different story. The lines were not straight. The angles were not true. She moved to the doorway of her bedroom, then to the kitchen. Everywhere she looked, the subtle distortions seemed to multiply. The door frames seemed to narrow, the floorboards appeared to tilt, and the once comforting familiarity of her apartment was replaced by a creeping sense of unease. It was like looking at a familiar painting that had been subtly altered, a single brushstroke out of place, but enough to throw the entire composition into disarray. A cold knot formed in her stomach. This wasn't just her imagination. This was real. The secret room, whatever it was, had changed something. It had warped her perception, or worse, it had warped the very fabric of her apartment. The hope for a fresh start, for a peaceful sanctuary, began to crumble, replaced by a chilling realization. She wasn't just living in an old building with character. She was living in a place that was actively defying the laws of physics, a place where the walls themselves were not right. The silence of the apartment, once a comfort, now felt like a watchful presence, the walls themselves seeming to lean in, their impossible angles whispering secrets she couldn't yet comprehend. The sun had set, and the shadows in the room deepened, twisting and stretching, mirroring the distortion she now perceived in the very structure of her home. The subtle wrongness of the walls became Alara's constant companion. It was a subtle, insidious presence, a visual hum that vibrated at the edge of her perception. Every doorway seemed to lean, every corner to sharpen, every flat surface to possess a barely perceptible curve. She found herself constantly remeasuring, rechecking, her tape measure becoming an extension of her increasingly frantic need for certainty. But the numbers never lied. The apartment's interior dimensions, once so reassuringly fixed, now seemed to fluctuate, shifting by millimeters, sometimes even centimeters when she wasn't directly looking. It was like trying to catch smoke, an elusive, maddening phenomenon that chipped away at her sense of reality. Sleep, once a welcome escape, became a battleground. The quiet of the night, which had initially been a comfort, now amplified every creak and groan of the old building. But these weren't the familiar sounds of settling wood or shifting foundations. These were new, distinct. It started as a faint rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. It came from the direction of the secret room, a soft, insistent sound that seemed to burrow directly into her skull. At first, she dismissed it as the pipes, or perhaps a branch scraping against the exterior wall, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too inconsistent to be natural. Sometimes it would be a slow, methodical beat, like a metronome set to a forgotten tempo. Other times it would quicken, a frantic, almost desperate series of rapid taps, as if something was trying to communicate, or perhaps trying to get out. Alara would lie awake in the darkness, her eyes wide open, straining to pinpoint the source. She'd hold her breath, her heart pounding in her ears, convinced that if she just listened hard enough, she would understand. But the sounds were elusive, fading into silence the moment she focused too intently, only to resume their maddening rhythm when she relaxed her guard. One night, around 2:17 a.m., the tapping became more pronounced. It wasn't just a tap. It was a scrape, a drag, a faint scratching sound that seemed to emanate from within the wall itself. It was the sound of something trying to claw its way through plaster and lath, a persistent, grating noise that set her teeth on edge. She imagined long skeletal fingers, or perhaps something more alien, something with chitinous claws, slowly, painstakingly, working its way towards her. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. She crept towards the living room, her flashlight beam cutting a trembling path through the oppressive darkness. The tapping and scratching grew louder as she approached the wall where the secret room lay hidden. It was no longer faint. It was a distinct, undeniable sound, a testament to something alive and active within that sealed space. She pressed her ear against the cool plaster, her breath catching in her throat. The sounds were directly on the other side, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't a rodent, not a squirrel. This was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It sounded like a series of short, sharp raps, followed by a longer, dragging scrape, then another series of raps. It was almost like a pattern, a code. Her mind, already frayed by the constant visual distortions, began to conjure images. What if it wasn't trying to get out? What if it was trying to get in? What if the wrongness of the walls wasn't just affecting her perception, but was a physical manifestation of whatever was trapped, or perhaps waiting on the other side? She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the seamless wall. The sounds continued, a relentless, maddening symphony of taps and scrapes. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and she was trapped inside with something that was slowly, methodically, trying to break free. Or perhaps trying to break her. The question echoed in the silent apartment, a chilling whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Are the sounds real, or is the room's strange geometry affecting her mind? The answer, she realized with a jolt of terror, might be both. The subtle wrongness of the walls, once a mere unsettling sensation, had escalated into a tangible, undeniable reality. It was no longer just a trick of the light or a figment of Alara's increasingly strained imagination. The apartment was physically changing. The shifts were minute, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. But to Alara, whose every waking moment was now consumed by the creeping dread of her surroundings, they were glaring, terrifying affirmations of her sanity, or rather, the apartment's profound lack thereof. Doorways, once perfectly rectangular, now seemed to narrow slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. The archway leading from the living room to the kitchen, which she had initially admired for its graceful curve, now appeared to pinch inward at the top, creating an almost claustrophobic effect. She found herself instinctively ducking her head as she passed through, even though there was ample clearance. It was a subconscious reaction to a visual distortion that her mind struggled to reconcile with logic. The corner of her bedroom, where a small writing desk was placed, had become a particular source of anxiety. It appeared sharper than it should, the angle of the two walls meeting at a point that felt unnaturally acute, almost piercing. She would often catch herself staring at it, her eyes trying to force the lines back into their proper 90-degree embrace, but they stubbornly refused, holding their impossible geometry with a silent, defiant malice. To combat this creeping madness, Alara began to leave small, mundane objects near the walls, a stack of coins by the baseboard, a single, unsharpened pencil resting against a door frame, a small ceramic coaster placed precisely at the corner of her bedroom. These were her silent sentinels, her objective markers in a world that was rapidly losing its objectivity. Each morning she would approach them with a mixture of dread and desperate hope, and each morning her dread was confirmed. The stack of coins would be infinitesimally closer to the wall, the pencil would have shifted by a millimeter or two, and the ceramic coaster would be nudged ever so slightly from its original position. The changes were tiny, almost negligible, but they were there. They were real. The apartment was breathing, contracting, and expanding, its very structure in a state of constant, unsettling flux. One morning around 7:45 a.m., she found a faint, almost invisible scratch mark on the polished wooden floor directly beneath the wall of the secret room. It was a fresh mark, thin and shallow, as if something had been dragged across the surface. She knelt, tracing the line with her finger. It led directly to the baseboard, disappearing beneath it. Her mind immediately went to the tapping and scratching sounds she'd been hearing at night. Was something inside the wall, something that could move, something that could leave physical traces? The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. It wasn't just the visual distortions anymore. It was physical evidence, undeniable proof that the apartment was not merely playing tricks on her mind, but was actively, physically, changing. The implications were terrifying. If the walls could shift, if the very structure of her home was fluid, what else could it do? Could it close in on her? Could it trap her? She began to feel a profound sense of vulnerability. Her home, her sanctuary, had become her prison. The familiar comfort of her belongings, her books, her maps, now felt like a cruel mockery, anchors in a reality that was rapidly dissolving around her. She was living in a house of cards, a structure that could collapse at any moment, not from a physical force, but from an unseen, impossible geometry. The question that had once been a whisper in her mind now screamed in her ears. How can the apartment be physically changing? There was no logical explanation, no scientific principle that could account for such a phenomenon. It defied everything she knew about the physical world, and that, more than anything, was what truly terrified her. The unknown, the impossible, had taken root in her home, and it was growing, slowly but surely, consuming her reality 1 millimeter, 1 degree, one impossible angle at a time. The silence of the apartment, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy shroud, pressing down on her, suffocating her with its unspoken secrets. The physical shifts in the apartment, coupled with the relentless, maddening sounds from the secret room, pushed Alara past the point of mere unease and into a desperate need for answers. Logic, her lifelong companion, demanded an explanation, however impossible. If the apartment was truly changing, if something unseen was scratching at the walls, then there had to be a reason, a history, a forgotten narrative that held the key to her terrifying present. Her archivist instincts, honed by years of sifting through dusty records and deciphering obscure texts, kicked in with a fierce urgency. The city archives became her new sanctuary, a place where the tangible weight of history offered a strange comfort against the fluid reality of her apartment. She spent hours poring over brittle deeds, faded blueprints, and microfilm newspaper clippings, her eyes scanning for any mention of her building, any hint of its past. The building, a grand old structure on Elm Street, had a long and varied history, serving as a boarding house, then a series of short-lived businesses before being converted into apartments in the early 1900s. Her search was methodical, starting with the earliest records and slowly working her way forward. Most of it was mundane: tax records, ownership transfers, minor structural repairs. But then a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then increasingly stark. There were gaps in the tenancy records for her specific apartment unit, periods of unexplained vacancy, sometimes lasting for years. And when tenants were listed, their stays were often remarkably short. She cross-referenced these names with other city records, hospital admissions, police reports, obituaries. The results sent a cold dread coiling in her stomach. A string of previous tenants from her unit, stretching back decades, shared a disturbingly similar fate. A young woman in 1932 admitted to the city asylum for acute melancholia and delusions of shifting architecture. A family in 1958 who simply vanished, their belongings left behind, the police report concluding with a chillingly vague, unexplained disappearance. A reclusive artist in 1971 found dead in his apartment, the cause listed as cardiac arrest, but the accompanying notes mentioned his frantic, nonsensical drawings of impossible geometric shapes. The records were old, incomplete, and often couched in the euphemisms of their time, but the underlying theme was unmistakable. They all hinted at a sickness, a madness that seemed to emanate from her apartment itself. The official explanations were always mundane stress, mental illness, natural causes, but the recurring motifs of disorientation, paranoia, and architectural anomalies were too consistent to be coincidental. Ilara felt a growing sense of kinship with these forgotten souls, these unwitting predecessors who had walked the same shifting floors, heard the same maddening sounds. What had they experienced? Had they too felt the walls breathe, seen the doorways narrow? Had they too been driven to the brink of sanity by the apartment's insidious influence? One particularly disturbing entry caught her eye, a brief, almost throwaway line in a 1947 police report concerning a tenant who had barricaded himself inside her very unit. He had been found raving about the geometry of fear and the angles that watch. He was subsequently committed, and the apartment remained vacant for 5 years after. The phrase "angles that watch" resonated with a chilling familiarity, echoing the old woman's warning, "Never let the walls know you're watching them." The archives closed at 5 p.m., but Ilara felt no relief. The weight of the past, the accumulated dread of generations, pressed down on her. She walked home through the bustling city streets, but her mind was still in the hushed silence of the archives, haunted by the ghosts of those who had come before her. The apartment, when she finally reached it, seemed to loom, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. She knew now that she wasn't just dealing with a structural anomaly or a quirky old building. She was living in a place with a dark, malevolent history, a place that consumed its inhabitants, slowly, inexorably driving them to madness or worse. The question that now burned in her mind was not what they had experienced, but how she could avoid their fate. The weight of the building's history pressed down on Ilara, a suffocating blanket of dread that made her apartment feel less like a home and more like a tomb. The knowledge of the previous tenants, their descent into madness or their unexplained disappearances gnawed at her. She felt a desperate need to talk to someone, anyone, who might understand, who might offer a shred of clarity in the swirling chaos of her new reality. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Abernathy, the elderly, reclusive neighbor she glimpsed only a few times in the hallway. She found him on a Tuesday afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., meticulously watering a small potted fern outside his apartment door. He was a frail man, his shoulders stooped with age, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes, when they met hers, were a watery blue clouded with a lifetime of unspoken stories. "Mr. Abernathy?" Ilara began, her voice a little too loud in the quiet hallway. He flinched, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his watering can. "Yes?" His voice was a dry rustle, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't look directly at her, his gaze fixed on the fern's delicate fronds. "I'm Ilara, from apartment 3B, she offered, gesturing vaguely towards her door. "I just moved in a few weeks ago." He nodded slowly, a barely perceptible movement. "I know." A silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Ilara shifted her weight, trying to find the right words, the delicate balance between polite, neighborly conversation and her desperate need for answers. "I was wondering," she ventured, "about the building. It's old, and I've been doing some research. It seems to have quite a history." Mr. Abernathy finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was a flicker of something in their depths, recognition perhaps, or a deep, abiding weariness. He turned back to his fern, meticulously plucking a yellowed leaf. "Old buildings have old stories," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Elara pressed on, her desperation overriding her usual caution. "I've noticed some strange things. The walls, they seem different. The angles aren't quite right." At the mention of the walls, Mr. Abernathy froze. His hand, still holding the watering can, began to tremble violently, spilling a small stream of water onto the polished hallway floor. His watery blue eyes widened, and a profound terror, raw and unmasked, flooded their depths. It was a fear that went beyond mere apprehension, a deep-seated horror that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. He dropped the watering can. It clattered against the floor, the sound echoing loudly in the silent hallway. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "The walls," he whispered, his voice a strained rasp. "You see them?" Elara nodded, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The intensity of his reaction was far beyond anything she had anticipated. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes darting nervously around the empty hallway, as if afraid of being overheard by the very walls they spoke of. "Never," he rasped, his voice barely a breath, "never let the walls know you're watching them." His words hung in the air, a chilling echo of the phrase she had found in the old police report, "the angles that watch." It wasn't just a turn of phrase, it was a warning, a desperate plea from someone who had seen too much. Before Elara could ask another question, before she could press him for more details, he stumbled backward, fumbling with his keys. He unlocked his door with trembling hands, his gaze still fixed on her, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. He slipped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Elara alone in the quiet hallway, the faint scent of damp earth and profound fear lingering in the air. What did he know? The question hammered in her mind, a relentless drumbeat. His terror was palpable, a testament to the very real, very present danger that lurked within the building. He had seen it, whatever it was. He had lived with it for decades, and his warning, delivered with such raw, unadulterated fear, was not a metaphor. It was a literal instruction, a desperate attempt to protect her from something that watched, something that knew. The silence of the hallway seemed to deepen, the walls themselves seeming to listen, their unseen eyes fixed on her, waiting. Mr. Abernathy's terrified whisper, "Never let the walls know you're watching them," echoed in Elara's mind, a chilling counterpoint to the rhythmic tapping that resumed from the secret room. His fear was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak that settled over her, confirming her deepest anxieties. The old man knew something profound and terrifying about the building, and his warning was not a metaphor. It was a desperate plea, a literal instruction from someone who had lived with the impossible for decades. Armed with this new, unsettling validation, Elara found herself drawn back to the secret room. The door, which she had left ajar after her initial terrifying discovery, now seemed to beckon, a dark maw promising answers, however dreadful. She stepped inside, the air still stale and heavy, but now charged with a new, almost electric tension. The faint hum she had felt before was more pronounced, a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of her feet and up into her chest. Her flashlight beam cut through the oppressive darkness, landing on the far wall. The geometric patterns, which had been faint and almost obscured by dust, were now clearer, as if they had somehow deepened, their lines more defined, their angles sharper. It was as if the room itself was slowly revealing them, peeling back layers of concealment. They were not decorative, not like any architectural motif she had ever seen. These were complex, intricate, and utterly alien. Lines intersected at impossible angles, forming shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. Triangles twisted into spirals, squares dissolved into Escher-like illusions, and circles seemed to ripple and distort. It was a non-Euclidean diagram, a visual language that spoke of dimensions beyond her comprehension. Yet, despite their unsettling nature, Elara felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards them. She moved closer, her fingers hovering inches from the wall. The plaster felt cool, almost cold, despite the oppressive stillness of the air. She traced the patterns with her eyes, trying to find a starting point, a logical sequence. It was like looking at a complex circuit board or a map of an alien city where every line and curve held a hidden meaning. As she focused, the faint hum in the room seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat, a low, resonant throb that filled her head. The patterns on the wall seemed to pulse faintly, a subtle internal luminescence that made them appear to shift and breathe. She felt a strange connection, a sense of recognition, as if these symbols were speaking to a part of her mind she didn't even know existed. She pulled out her phone, intending to take pictures to document them, but the screen remained stubbornly dark, unresponsive. The battery was full, the phone perfectly functional just moments before. It was as if the room itself was rejecting the intrusion of modern technology, demanding that she engage with its secrets on its own terms. Frustrated but undeterred, Ilara pulled out a small notebook and a pencil from her bag. She began to sketch, meticulously copying the patterns, line by line, angle by angle. It was a slow, painstaking process, her hand moving with a precision she didn't know she possessed. As she drew, she felt a strange sense of clarity, a fleeting glimpse into the underlying logic of the impossible shapes. It was like a puzzle, and each line she copied, each angle she reproduced, brought her closer to solving it. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with an unseen energy. The faint hum intensified, a low guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Alara ignored it, her focus entirely consumed by the patterns. She felt a strange sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand, to decipher this alien language before it was too late. Hours passed, marked only by the deepening shadows outside the small, windowless room. Ilara's hand ached, her eyes burned, but she couldn't stop. The patterns were becoming clearer, more defined, almost three-dimensional. She felt as if she was not just copying them, but somehow activating them, bringing them to life. A new question began to form in her mind, a chilling realization that sent a fresh wave of dread through her. What did they mean? It was no longer a question of architectural anomaly or forgotten history. This was something else, something ancient and powerful, something that was slowly, inexorably revealing itself to her. And she, Alara, the archivist, was now inextricably linked to its unfolding. The room, once empty, now felt pregnant with unspoken meaning, its walls whispering secrets that only she could hear, only she could begin to understand. The geometric patterns from the secret room had begun to bleed into Alara's subconscious, twisting her nights into a labyrinth of impossible architecture. Sleep, once a refuge, became a new battleground, a place where the wrongness of the apartment pursued her with relentless, suffocating intensity. Her dreams were no longer the fragmented, nonsensical narratives of a tired mind. They were vivid, coherent, and terrifyingly real. It started subtly. Faint lines, like those on the secret room's wall, would appear at the edges of her vision in the dreamscape, almost imperceptible at first. Then they would solidify, forming corridors that stretched into infinity, their angles shifting and distorting with every step she took. She was always alone in these dreams, a solitary figure lost in a maze of impossible geometry. The walls would press in, then recede, the floor would tilt, and the ceiling would loom, all in a silent, disorienting dance. The silence in these dream labyrinths was profound, broken only by the sound of her own frantic breathing and the faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the dream itself. It was the same low hum she felt in the secret room, amplified, distorted, and inescapable. She would try to scream, but no sound would escape her throat. She would try to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the shifting ground. One night, around 3:17 a.m., the dream was particularly vivid. She found herself in a vast, echoing chamber, its walls covered in the same intricate non-Euclidean diagram she had been sketching. The patterns pulsed with a sickly internal light, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and stretched like living things. In the center of the chamber, a single, dark opening appeared, a void that seemed to draw all light and sound into its depths. A faint whisper, distorted and guttural, seemed to emanate from the void, calling her name. It wasn't a human voice, but something ancient, something that resonated deep within her bones. She felt an irresistible pull towards it, a terrifying compulsion to step into the darkness, to become one with the impossible architecture. Her dream self struggled, fought against the unseen force, but it was futile. She was being drawn in, slowly, inexorably, towards the void. She woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, but the oppressive atmosphere of the dream clung to her like a shroud. She could still feel the phantom pull, the echo of the impossible angles, the faint guttural whisper calling her name. It was as if something from the dream had followed her out, a shadowy tendril reaching for her even in the waking world. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, a heavy weight that settled in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide open, trying to convince herself that it was just a dream, a product of her overactive imagination and the stress of her new apartment. But the lingering sensation, the profound sense of wrongness, told a different story. She got out of bed, her legs still trembling from the dream. She walked to the living room, her gaze immediately drawn to the wall of the secret room. The seamless plaster seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were breathing. She pressed her ear against it, listening. The tapping was gone, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible hum, the same hum that had filled her dreams. A chilling thought solidified in her mind. These weren't just dreams, they were something more. They were a connection, a bridge between her reality and whatever impossible dimension lay beyond the secret room. Was something reaching for her while she slept? Was it trying to communicate, or was it trying to pull her in, to make her a part of its own maddening reality, just as it had done to the previous tenants? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The line between waking and dreaming, between reality and nightmare, had blurred, and Alara was no longer sure which side she was on. The dreams had become a relentless assault, blurring the lines between sleep and waking, reality and nightmare. Alara felt herself unraveling, the constant psychological pressure of the shifting walls and the unseen presence in the secret room taking its toll. She was isolated, her only confidant, an elderly, terrified neighbor who spoke in cryptic warnings. The need for a familiar face, a grounding presence, became overwhelming. She called Liam. Liam was an old friend from university, a pragmatic, no-nonsense graphic designer with a healthy skepticism for anything that couldn't be explained by logic or science. He was the kind of person who would scoff at ghost stories and dissect urban legends with a clinical detachment. He was exactly what Alara needed, a dose of objective reality. She didn't tell him everything, not at first, just that she was feeling a bit overwhelmed by the move, and the old apartment was proving to be more characterful than she'd anticipated. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, around 1:15 p.m., a six-pack of her favorite craft beer in hand and a wide, reassuring grin on his face. The moment he stepped through the doorway, however, his smile faltered. His eyes, usually bright and full of life, narrowed slightly as he took in the apartment. "Whoa," he said, his voice losing some of its usual cheerfulness. "It's got a vibe." Alara tried to laugh, but it came out as a strained, brittle sound. "It's an old building," she offered, a weak defense. Liam didn't respond immediately. He walked into the living room, his gaze sweeping across the walls, lingering for a moment on the seamless stretch where the secret room lay hidden. Alara watched him, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. Would he see it? Would he feel it? The subtle wrongness, the impossible angles, the oppressive atmosphere that had become her constant companion? He ran a hand along the wall, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's heavy," he finally said, his voice low. "The air, it feels thick, like a storm's coming." He couldn't see the shifting walls, Alara realized with a pang of disappointment, but he felt the wrongness. He felt the oppressive atmosphere, the subtle distortion that permeated the very air of the apartment. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She wasn't entirely mad. They sat on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and Alara began to tell him everything. She started with the blueprints, the missing 3 feet, the discovery of the hidden door. She described the dust-filled room, the strange geometric patterns, the faint hum. She told him about the tapping sounds, the physical shifts in the walls, the scratch marks on the floor. She even recounted Mr. Abernathy's chilling warning. She left out the dreams, for now, fearing they would push him too far into the realm of the unbelievable. Liam listened patiently, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. He asked questions, logical, probing questions, trying to find a rational explanation for each anomaly. Could it be structural settling? He asked about the shifting walls. Old pipes? About the tapping. Just an old, forgotten storage space? About the secret room. Alara countered each suggestion with the evidence she had meticulously gathered, consistent, deliberate nature of the tapping. The physical movement of objects she had placed as markers, the sheer impossibility of the geometric patterns. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the apartment seemed to grow heavier, the air thicker. Liam, usually so animated, became quieter, his movements more subdued. He kept glancing at the wall of the secret room, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Alara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "this isn't healthy. This place is getting to you. You need to leave." He urged her to pack a bag, to come stay with him for a few days, to get some distance from the apartment. He spoke of fresh air, of a change of scenery, of getting her mind right. He was trying to be rational, to offer a practical solution, but Alara knew it was more than just stress or fatigue. "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't leave. Not yet." She was obsessed, she realized. Obsessed with the mystery, with the need to understand. The apartment had become a puzzle, a complex, terrifying enigma that she felt compelled to solve. It was a dangerous compulsion, she knew, but she couldn't resist it. The thought of walking away, of leaving the secrets of the secret room undiscovered, was unbearable. Liam sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Alara, this isn't you. You're not usually like this. This place is changing you." He was right. She was changing. The apartment was consuming her, drawing her deeper into its impossible reality, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. The mystery was too compelling, the pull too strong. "I need to know," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I need to know what's going on here." Liam looked at the wall, then back at Alara, a profound sadness in his eyes. He knew he couldn't convince her. He knew she was already too far gone. The question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Will he be able to help, or will he be drawn into the danger? Alara didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not alone in this anymore. Liam, by simply being there, by feeling the wrongness, had become a part of her terrifying new reality. Liam's visit, while offering a brief, fragile tether to sanity, ultimately solidified Alara's resolve. His inability to see the shifting walls, yet his palpable discomfort with the apartment's oppressive atmosphere, confirmed her fears and validated her experience. She wasn't imagining it. The wrongness was real, a pervasive entity that affected even the most skeptical of minds. But his plea for her to leave, to abandon the mystery, only hardened her obsession. She had to know, she had to understand. The days that followed Liam's departure were marked by an escalating sense of urgency. The tapping from the secret room, which had been a sporadic, rhythmic presence, now became almost constant, a frantic, insistent drumming that permeated the very fabric of the apartment. It was no longer just a sound. It was a demand, a desperate plea, or, perhaps, a furious warning. Alara had, in her growing recklessness, left the door to the secret room ajar after her last foray inside. It was a small act of defiance, a subconscious challenge to the unseen forces that governed the space. She wanted to believe that by leaving it open, she was asserting some control, inviting the secrets to reveal themselves. But one morning, around 7 o'clock a.m., as the first weak rays of sunlight struggled to penetrate the apartment's heavy curtains, she found it shut. Not merely closed, but sealed. The faint line of the cleverly concealed seam, which she had painstakingly uncovered, was now invisible, swallowed by the smooth, unbroken expanse of the wall. It was as if the door had never existed, as if the wall had simply healed itself, erasing any trace of its hidden maw. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than any she had felt before, seized her. She rushed to the spot, her fingers frantically tracing the plaster, searching for the familiar indentation of the handle, the faint outline of the seam. Nothing. The wall was solid, unyielding, a seamless barrier that mocked her with its impenetrable silence. Then, from within, the tapping began. It was no longer rhythmic, no longer a pattern. It was a furious, chaotic barrage, a desperate hammering that vibrated through the wall and into her very bones. It sounded like something trapped, something thrashing against its confines, desperate to escape. Or perhaps, desperate to get out. Alara pressed her ear against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. The sounds were frantic, demanding, a cacophony of scrapes, thuds, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, or perhaps profound terror. She tried to open it. She pushed, she pulled, she hammered on the spot where the handle should have been, her knuckles bruising against the unyielding plaster. She even tried to pry at the invisible seam with a screwdriver, but it was useless. The wall was solid, impenetrable, as if it had never been breached. The tapping intensified, becoming a frantic, almost pleading rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It was a desperate plea, a cry for help that resonated with a chilling familiarity. A new, more terrifying thought began to form in her mind, a chilling realization that sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. What if it wasn't trying to get out? What if it was trying to trap her? What if the door had closed not to contain something, but to isolate her, to cut off her escape, to ensure that she, too, would become a permanent part of the apartment's impossible geometry? The apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, its unseen occupant growing more powerful, more demanding. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and the faint hum that had been a constant companion now pulsed with a malevolent energy. Alara backed away from the wall, her eyes wide with terror, her mind racing. The tapping continued, a relentless, maddening drumbeat that seemed to echo the frantic pounding of her own heart. The question hung in the air, a chilling whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Is something trapped in there, or something trying to trap her? The answer, she realized with a jolt of pure terror, might be both, and she was caught in the middle. The sealed door to the secret room and the frantic, demanding sounds emanating from within plunged Alara into a new depth of terror. The apartment, once a source of intellectual fascination, had become a living nightmare, its walls a tangible threat. Her isolation, already profound, was now absolute. Liam was gone, and the only other person who seemed to understand Mr. Abernathy had retreated into his own reclusive world. Desperate, Alara knew she had to try again. She waited until late afternoon, around 4:00 p.m., when the building was at its quietest. She knocked on Mr. Abernathy's door, a hesitant, almost apologetic rap. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, her knuckles aching against the solid wood. Still nothing. Just as she was about to give up, defeated, the door creaked open a sliver. Mr. Abernathy's face, pale and drawn, peered out, his eyes wide with a familiar terror. "Please, Mr. Abernathy," Alara pleaded, her voice hoarse with desperation. "I need your help. The room, it's sealed, and the sounds—" He hesitated, his gaze darting nervously down the hallway, as if expecting the walls themselves to listen. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he opened the door wider, ushering her inside. His apartment was a mirror image of hers, but filled with a lifetime of accumulated clutter, stacks of old newspapers, dusty books, and an assortment of strange, intricate models of buildings, all with subtly distorted angles. He led her to a worn armchair, its fabric faded and threadbare. He sat opposite her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. "I knew this day would come," he began, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I've seen it before. They always find it." The room. He spoke of the building's original architect, a man named Alistair Finch, a brilliant but eccentric visionary from the late 1800s. Finch, Mr. Abernathy explained, was obsessed with what he called spatial warping. He believed that architecture wasn't just about physical structures, but about manipulating the very fabric of space and dimension. He sought to create buildings that could resonate with unseen energies, that could act as conduits to other realities. He was mad, of course, Mr. Abernathy rasped, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. Or perhaps he was simply ahead of his time. He built this place, this entire building, as an experiment, a grand, terrible experiment. The secret room, he explained, was Finch's failed anchor. It was meant to be a stable point, a controlled gateway to another dimension, a place where the two realities could merge without chaos. But Finch, in his hubris, had miscalculated. The anchor was unstable, a fluctuating portal that slowly, inexorably, drew in and distorted the surrounding space. The previous tenants, Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice barely audible, they weren't just driven mad, they were absorbed. Their minds, their very consciousnesses, became part of the building, part of it. He gestured vaguely towards the wall, his eyes wide with a profound, ancient fear. The merging of realities. It's slow, insidious. You don't even realize it's happening until it's too late. He spoke of the sounds, the tapping and scratching. "It's trying to communicate," he said, his voice trembling. "It's trying to pull you in. It wants to make you part of its structure, just like the others." Alara felt a cold wave of understanding wash over her. The geometric patterns, the shifting walls, the dreams, it all clicked into place. The entity wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was the building itself, or rather the consciousness of the other dimension, slowly, methodically consuming her reality. "Is there any way to stop it?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Abernathy shook his head, a profound sadness in his eyes. Finch tried. He sealed the room, tried to cut off the connection, but it was too late. Once it starts, it never truly stops. It just waits. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a desperate pity. "You have to leave, child, now, before it's too late for you too." But Alara couldn't leave. Not now. Not with this new, terrifying knowledge. The mystery had deepened, the stakes had risen, and she was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, caught in the cosmic struggle between two realities. The question that now burned in her mind was not if she could stop it, but how. And more terrifyingly, could she even try? The silence in Mr. Abernathy's apartment was heavy, filled with the unspoken horrors of a century and the chilling realization that Alara was now part of its ongoing, terrifying history. Mr. Abernathy's words, delivered with the weary resignation of a man who had witnessed too much, resonated with a chilling truth. The building was not merely old, it was alive, a sentient entity slowly consuming its inhabitants, merging their consciousnesses with its own impossible geometry. The secret room was not just a hidden space, but a failed anchor, a fluctuating portal to another dimension. The geometric patterns, Alara now understood, were not just diagrams, but a language, a form of communication with the entity, a way to strengthen the connection between realities. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, Alara returned to her apartment, the weight of Mr. Abernathy's despair heavy on her shoulders. The frantic tapping from the sealed room had subsided, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of her living space. It was a sound she now recognized as the entity's voice, a silent, pervasive whisper that spoke of impossible angles and shifting dimensions. She stood before the seamless wall, her fingers tracing the invisible line where the door to the secret room lay hidden. The plaster felt cool beneath her touch, but she could feel the faint vibration, the subtle thrum of the entity's presence. Her archivist's mind, usually so focused on the tangible and the historical, now grappled with concepts that defied all logic and reason. She remembered the compulsion she had felt to decipher the patterns, the strange clarity that had come with meticulously copying them into her notebook. It was as if, by interacting with them, she was not just observing, but actively participating, strengthening the connection to whatever lay on the other side. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of terror and a strange, almost perverse fascination. She retrieved her notebook, its pages filled with the intricate non-Euclidean diagrams. She spread it open on the floor, the faint hum in the room intensifying as she did so. The pattern seemed to pulse faintly, a subtle internal luminescence that made them appear to shift and breathe. She traced one of the more complex designs with her finger, a series of interlocking triangles that seemed to fold in on themselves. As her finger followed the lines, the walls of her own apartment groaned and shifted more violently than ever before. A deep, resonant creak echoed from the ceiling, and a fine dust like powdered bones sifted down from the plaster. The floor beneath her feet seemed to undulate, a subtle, sickening sway that made her stomach lurch. It was as if the apartment was responding to her touch, its very structure groaning under the strain of the merging realities. She looked up, her eyes wide, with a terrifying realization. The corner of her bedroom, which had always appeared subtly acute, now seemed to sharpen further, its angle almost piercing. The doorway to the kitchen, already narrowed, now seemed to pinch inward, creating a claustrophobic tunnel. The entire apartment was a living, breathing entity, its geometry in a constant state of flux, responding to her interaction with the patterns. The hum intensified, becoming a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of immense power, of ancient, alien intelligence. Alara felt a strange sense of communion, a terrifying understanding of the entity's purpose. It wasn't just trying to communicate, it was trying to absorb. It was trying to make her a part of its structure, to add her consciousness to the chorus of forgotten souls embedded in its walls. She closed her eyes, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She could feel the pull, a subtle, almost irresistible force drawing her deeper into the impossible geometry. It was like a siren song, beautiful and terrifying, promising an end to her isolation, emerging with something vast and unknowable. But then Mr. Abernathy's words echoed in her mind. They were absorbed. Their minds, their very consciousnesses, became part of the building. The image of the reclusive artist, his frantic, nonsensical drawings, flashed before her eyes. She didn't want to be absorbed. She didn't want to become another forgotten whisper in the walls. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the patterns in her notebook. The question that now burned in her mind was not what it was that was trying to get through, but how she could stop it. She had inadvertently strengthened the connection, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could also disrupt it. The apartment groaned around her, its walls a symphony of shifting angles and impossible dimensions, waiting for her next move. The game, she realized, was far from over. The hum from the walls, once a subtle vibration, had now become a constant low thrum, a pervasive presence that filled every corner of Alara's apartment. It was the entity's voice, a silent, resonant whisper that spoke of impossible angles and merging realities. The frantic tapping from the secret room had ceased entirely, replaced by an unnerving silence that was far more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of anticipation, the quiet before a storm, the stillness of a predator waiting for its prey. Alara stood in the center of her living room, her notebook clutched in her hand, its pages filled with the intricate non-Euclidean diagrams. She had spent hours poring over them, searching for a flaw, a weakness, anything that could disrupt the connection she had inadvertently strengthened. But the patterns remained inscrutable, their alien logic defying her every attempt at comprehension. The air in the apartment grew heavy, thick with an unseen energy. The subtle distortions in the walls, which had become her constant companions, now seemed to intensify. The floor beneath her feet felt like a living thing, subtly undulating, its surface shifting beneath her weight. The light from the windows seemed to dim, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and stretched like living things. Then a new sound emerged. It was faint at first, a barely perceptible whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was distorted, guttural, like a voice struggling to form words through a thick, viscous medium. But as Elara listened, her blood ran cold. It was calling her name. Elara. The sound was not human, not truly. It was a chorus of whispers, a symphony of forgotten voices, all coalescing into a single resonant call. It was the voices of the previous tenants, the absorbed consciousnesses, their minds now a part of the building, their pleas and warnings twisted into a terrifying invitation. Elara, come. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the apartment with a chilling, ethereal chorus. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding her, pressing in on her, drawing her deeper into the entity's embrace. She felt an irresistible pull, a terrifying compulsion to follow the sound, to surrender to the voices that called her name. Her gaze was drawn to the seamless wall where the secret room lay hidden. The plaster, which had been solid and impenetrable, now seemed to shimmer faintly, a subtle internal luminescence that pulsed with the rhythm of the whispers. The invisible seam, which had been so expertly concealed, now seemed to glow, a faint ethereal line that outlined the hidden door. Then, with a low, mournful groan that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the building, the door to the secret room creaked open on its own. It moved slowly, deliberately, revealing a gaping maw of absolute darkness. The air that wafted out was thick with the scent of decay and stagnation, but now it was tinged with something else, something sweet and cloying, like the scent of dying flowers. The whispers intensified, becoming a desperate, pleading chorus. Come, Elara, come. Elara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind screaming in protest. Every instinct, every fiber of her being urged her to flee, to run from the terrifying invitation. But the pull was too strong, the compulsion too powerful. It was like a dream, a waking nightmare from which she could not escape. She took a step forward, then another, her legs moving as if of their own accord. The whispers grew louder, more triumphant, their ethereal voices filling her head, drowning out her own thoughts. She was a puppet on a string, drawn by an unseen force towards the gaping maw of darkness. The question that had haunted her for weeks now screamed in her mind, the desperate, final plea, what does it want? The answer, she realized with a jolt of pure terror, was simple. It wanted her. It wanted to absorb her, to make her a part of its impossible geometry, another voice in its eternal chorus. The secret room, once a source of mystery, was now a terrifying gateway, and Elara was being drawn inexorably toward its depths, a willing, yet unwilling, sacrifice. The silence of the apartment, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy shroud, pressing down on her, suffocating her with its unspoken secrets. The whispers, a chorus of forgotten voices, grew louder, more insistent, pulling Elara towards the gaping maw of the secret room. Her legs moved as if of their own accord, each step a surrender to the unseen force that compelled her. The air grew heavy, thick with the cloying scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the taste of fear. The hum from the walls intensified, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through her bones, a prelude to the impossible. She stepped over the threshold, into the absolute darkness of the secret room. The door, which had creaked open on its own, now swung shut behind her with a soft, almost imperceptible click, sealing her in. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that pressed in on her, a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a living, breathing presence. Then, the geometric patterns on the far wall began to glow, not with a warm, inviting light, but with a faint, sickly luminescence, a phosphorescent green that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. The lines, once etched faintly into the plaster, now seemed to float in the air, three-dimensional constructs of impossible angles and shifting planes. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that defied all known geometry, a visual language of madness. As Elara watched, mesmerized and terrified, the glowing patterns began to expand, to ripple outwards from the wall, like a stone dropped into a still pond. The plaster itself seemed to dissolve, to melt away, revealing a shimmering fluid-like portal. It was not a window, not a doorway, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow, a gateway to something utterly alien. Through the shimmering veil, Elara saw it. A dimension of impossible, maddening architecture. structures that defied gravity, buildings that folded in on themselves, corridors that stretched into infinity, all constructed from the same non-Euclidean geometry that adorned the walls of the secret room. It was a landscape of pure, unadulterated wrongness, a place where the very fabric of reality had been twisted and warped into a terrifying, beautiful nightmare. And then she saw the figure. It emerged from the swirling depths of the portal, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to be composed of the same shifting angles and impossible lines as the architecture around it. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and distorted. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a vague, humanoid outline that seemed to absorb the sickly green light around it. It was the entity, the sentient architecture, the thing that had been calling her name, the thing that had been slowly, inexorably merging its reality with hers. It moved towards her, not walking, but gliding, its form rippling and shifting with each impossible movement. It was silent, but Alara could feel its presence, a cold, ancient intelligence that filled the room, pressing down on her, suffocating her with its vastness. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it bordered on paralysis. The entity stopped a few feet from her, its shadowy form looming over her, casting a distorted, impossible shadow on the glowing patterns. She could feel its gaze, a silent, penetrating scrutiny that seemed to strip away her very essence, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The question that had haunted her for weeks now screamed in her mind, a desperate final plea. What is this place? The answer, she realized with a jolt of pure terror, was simple. It was the other side, the dimension that Finch had sought to anchor, the reality that was slowly, inexorably consuming her own. And she, Alara, was now standing on its threshold, a willing yet unwilling guest in a world of impossible geometry and maddening architecture. The entity reached out a shadowy, elongated limb, its form rippling and shifting, an invitation to join its impossible reality. The shadowy figure, a being of pure geometry and shifting angles, loomed before Alara, its presence a cold, ancient intelligence that filled the secret room. It reached out a shadowy, elongated limb, not to harm, but to invite, its form rippling and shifting like disturbed water. Alara felt a profound sense of dread, but also a strange, almost hypnotic fascination. This was it, the source of the wrongness, the architect of her nightmare. Then a torrent of images flooded her mind, not through her eyes, but directly into her consciousness. It was a silent, overwhelming download of information, a history of the entity, of its purpose, of its victims. She saw the previous tenants, not as individuals, but as shimmering, translucent forms, their consciousnesses embedded in the very walls of the building. They were not dead, not truly. They were absorbed, their minds a part of the entity's vast collective being, their individual identities dissolved into a chorus of silent whispers. The entity, she understood, was not malevolent in the human sense. It did not seek to inflict pain or suffering. It sought to expand, to integrate, to make all things part of its own perfect geometric structure. It was a sentient architecture, a living, breathing dimension that had found a weak point in Alara's reality, the failed anchor of Alistair Finch's experiment. She saw Finch himself, a younger, more vibrant man, his eyes alight with a dangerous brilliance. He had sought to control it, to harness its power, to bridge the gap between dimensions. But he had failed. The anchor was unstable, and the entity, once awakened, had begun its slow, inexorable consumption. The images shifted, showing her the fate of the others. The young woman in 1932, her mind unraveling as the walls whispered impossible truths. The family in 1958, their fear a delicious offering as their reality dissolved around them. The reclusive artist in 1971, his frantic drawings, a desperate attempt to communicate the impossible geometry that was consuming him. Their consciousnesses, their fears, their memories, all became part of the entity, a vast, ever-growing tapestry of absorbed minds. And now it wanted her. It didn't want to harm Alara. It wanted to absorb her, to make her part of its own structure, to add her unique perspective, her archivist's mind, to its vast collective consciousness. It showed her a vision of herself, not as a human, but as a shimmering, geometric form, her essence woven into the very fabric of the impossible architecture. It was a terrifying prospect, a complete annihilation of her individuality, yet there was a strange, almost seductive allure to it, the promise of ultimate understanding, of becoming one with a vast, ancient intelligence. But then, a single clear thought cut through the overwhelming torrent of information. No, It was her own thought, her own voice, small but defiant, in the face of the entity's vastness. She was Alara. She was an archivist. She was a human being with her own memories, her own fears, her own unique identity. She would not be absorbed. She would not become another whisper in the walls. The entity seemed to sense her defiance. The shadowy limb which had been reaching out an invitation now seemed to recoil slightly, its form rippling with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The whispers, which had been a chorus of invitation, now seemed to take on a different tone, a faint, almost imperceptible hum of confusion. Alara looked at the entity, then at the shimmering portal behind it, then back at the glowing geometric patterns on the wall. The truth, in all its terrifying, impossible glory, was laid bare before her. The entity was bound by its own rules, its own geometry. It was a being of order, albeit an alien, maddening order. And within that order, there had to be a weakness, a way to disrupt its perfect, consuming logic. The question that now burned at her mind was not what it was, but how to fight it. The secret room, once a gateway to madness, was now a battlefield, and Alara, a single human, was about to wage war against a sentient dimension. The truth, a chilling revelation delivered directly into her mind, solidified Alara's resolve. The entity was not a malevolent spirit, but a sentient architecture, a dimension seeking to expand, to absorb. It was bound by its own rigid geometric rules, a cosmic order that, however alien, must contain a weakness. Her archivist mind, accustomed to finding patterns in chaos, now sought a flaw in the entity's perfect, consuming logic. She looked at the glowing geometric patterns on the wall, the very language of the entity. She had copied them, traced them, inadvertently strengthening the connection. But if interaction could strengthen, could it also disrupt? She remembered Mr. Abernathy's fragmented tales of Alistair Finch, the architect's theories of spatial warping, his attempts to control the gateway. Finch had failed, but he had understood the principles. Alara's gaze darted between the patterns on the wall and the shadowy, shifting form of the entity. It was waiting, its vast, ancient intelligence observing her, expecting her surrender. But she would not surrender. She would fight. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to trace the patterns on the wall, not with the meticulous care of a scholar, but with a frantic, almost desperate energy. She didn't try to understand them. She tried to break them. She reversed the direction of the lines. She skipped segments. She deliberately misaligned angles. She was defacing its sacred text, corrupting its perfect geometry. As her fingers moved, the hum in the room intensified, becoming a high-pitched whine, a sound of pure agony. The glowing patterns on the wall flickered, their sickly green light wavering, as if struggling to maintain their form. The shadowy entity before her rippled violently, its impossible angles distorting, its form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. It was reacting. She was hurting it. Alara pressed on, her movements becoming more frenzied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She traced a complex spiral in reverse, then slammed her palm against a series of interlocking triangles, disrupting their flow. The room groaned around her, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. The floor beneath her feet bucked and swayed, and a fine dust, like powdered bone, rained down from the ceiling. The shimmering portal behind the entity began to destabilize. The fluid-like surface rippled violently, its colors swirling into a chaotic maelstrom of light and shadow. The impossible architecture of the other dimension, visible through the portal, seemed to shudder, its structures twisting and collapsing in on themselves. The entity let out a silent scream, a wave of pure, unadulterated agony that washed over Alara, threatening to overwhelm her. Its shadowy form lunged forward, its elongated limbs reaching for her, its silent cry a desperate attempt to stop her. But Alara was beyond fear. She was driven by a primal need to survive, to escape the fate of the absorbed. With a final, desperate surge of energy, she slammed her fist against the center of the largest, most complex pattern on the wall, a nexus of impossible lines. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The glowing patterns on the wall exploded outwards, a blinding flash of sickly green light that filled the room. The hum reached an unbearable crescendo, a piercing shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The shimmering portal behind the entity convulsed, its fluid surface churning violently, then began to collapse in on itself, shrinking rapidly, like a drain pulling water. The entity let out another silent scream, its shadowy form thrashing wildly, its elongated limbs flailing in a desperate attempt to maintain its hold. But it was losing. The connection was breaking. Ilara didn't wait. She turned and ran, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. She burst through the now glowing outline of the secret room's door, into the relative sanity of her living room. The apartment was groaning, its walls shuddering, its impossible angles twisting and contorting. She didn't look back. She slammed the door shut, not with a gentle click, but with a desperate primal force that echoed through the entire building. The sound of the collapsing portal, a final, guttural roar, reverberated from within, then faded into a profound, echoing silence. She leaned against the door, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was still, the hum gone, the walls no longer shifting. She had escaped. But the question that now burned in her mind was not if she had truly escaped, but what she had unleashed, and what lingering scars the impossible geometry had left on her own reality. The silence of the apartment was heavy, filled with the echoes of a battle fought and won, but at what cost? Months later, the scent of old wood and dust motes still clung to Ilara, a phantom aroma that no amount of scrubbing or fresh air could truly dispel. She had moved out of the apartment, fled the city even, seeking refuge in a small, nondescript town where the buildings were stubbornly square and the angles reassuringly right. The nightmares still came, of course, of shifting walls and impossible geometry, of shadowy figures and the silent screams of absorbed consciousnesses. But they were less frequent now, fading into the background noise of her new, quieter life. She was forever changed. The world, once a place of solid, predictable forms, now held a subtle, unsettling fluidity. She could still perceive the wrongness, the slight imperfections in geometry that no one else seemed to notice. A doorway in a coffee shop might seem to narrow for a fleeting second. A corner of a room might appear subtly acute. A floorboard might groan with a sound that was just a little too deep, a little too resonant. She saw the world through a new lens, a lens that revealed the fragile, permeable membrane between realities. It was a burden, a constant reminder of the impossible, but also, strangely, a unique perspective, a secret knowledge that set her apart. She had tried to explain it once to a new friend, a kind, empathetic woman who listened patiently, her eyes filled with concern. But as Ilara spoke of sentient architecture and merging dimensions, she saw the familiar flicker of polite disbelief, the subtle shift in expression that signaled a retreat into the comfortable confines of normalcy. She stopped trying. Some truths were too vast, too terrifying to be shared. The final scene unfolds on a crisp autumn morning, around 10 o'clock a.m., back in the city. Back at the old building on Elm Street, a moving truck, its side emblazoned with a cheerful, brightly colored logo, is parked haphazardly at the curb. A young man, full of hope and optimism, his face alight with the excitement of a new beginning, carries a box labeled Kitchen through the ornate front door. He is the new tenant, drawn by the surprisingly affordable rent and the building's charming character. He walks into apartment 3B, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The sunlight streams through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment is clean, freshly painted, its walls a uniform, reassuring beige. There are no visible distortions, no obvious signs of the impossible geometry that once permeated its very fabric. The hum is gone, the tapping silenced, the portal sealed. He sets the box down in a living room, his gaze sweeping across the space. He runs a hand over the seamless wall where the secret room lies hidden, a faint smile playing on his lips. It's a good wall, solid, unyielding. He imagines hanging a large piece of art there, a vibrant splash of color to break the monotony. As his hand rests on the plaster, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoes from deep within the wall. It's almost imperceptible, a soft, insistent sound that seems to vibrate just beneath the surface. He pauses, his brow furrowed in concentration. He listens, but the sound fades, swallowed by the settling groans of the old building. He shrugs, dismissing it as the pipes, or perhaps a neighbor. Old buildings, he thinks, have their quirks. He turns away, his mind already on unpacking, on the promise of a new life, a fresh start. The cycle is poised to begin again. The walls, silent and watchful, wait. The faint, rhythmic tapping resumes, a soft, insistent beat, a prelude to the impossible, a whisper of the horrors that await the new tenant. The apartment, once a battleground, is now a silent, patient predator, and its next victim has just walked through the door.